Looking at the train, we see a beloved caboose and a Chessie System hopper car that is now patched for the CSX that was formed about 2 years before this photo was taken. Seeing the Chessie System again sure brings back pleasant memories for me, so much so that it's given me an idea for another video. It was a blue-hour twilight in 2017 when we stumbled across an unexpected surprise. The vestiges of several fallen flag railroads sat quietly in the remains of the New York Central's yard in Avis, Pennsylvania, but the one that stood out to me was a surprisingly intact Chessie System boxcar. Because the Chessie System was a holding company and not a railroad, it didn't own any locomotives or rolling stock. Instead, all equipment on the roster fell under one of the three component railroads. And while all three railroads shared the common paint scheme of yellow, vermilion, and blue, the actual ownership of the equipment was represented by the reporting marks of the C&O, the B&O, or the Western Maryland, WM. Note that this boxcar has a private reporting mark. The Chessie System owned the Chesapeake in Ohio, the Baltimore in Ohio, the Western Maryland, and several other smaller carriers. It was incorporated in Virginia on February 26, 1973, and later acquired the C&O, which also controlled the other companies, on June 15th. It operated in more than a dozen states including Delaware, D.C., Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and the Canadian province of Ontario. The relationship between the three roads was an incestuous one, as the three had been closely related since the 1960s, with the C&O acquiring a controlling interest in the B&O in 1962, and the two had jointly controlled the Western Maryland since 1967. During its first years in operation and the dark days of the Penn Central merger, there were hopes that the Chessie System would acquire the Erie, Lackawanna, and the Reading Railroad to keep them out of the huge Conrail merger. But because agreements between Chessie and the labor unions couldn't be reached, the Chessie backed out of the deal. The name for the new company was fitting, since the original C&O Railway had been widely known as the Chessie System since the 1930s, and the prime source of revenue was coal mined in West Virginia and transporting auto parts and finished motor vehicles. The signature of the Chessie System was the large emblem that incorporated the outline of the C&O's famous Chessie the Kitten logo that was on the front of all Chessie System locomotives, and also served as the C in the Chessie System on the locomotive's flanks and on other rolling stock. On November 1st, 1980, the Chessie System merged with Seaboard Coastline Industries, another holding company, to form the CSX Corporation, not to be confused with CSX Transportation, the railroad. However, the Chessie image continued to be applied to new and repainted equipment until CSX brought in its own paint scheme in 1986. The next year, in 1987, the B&O and C&O were legally merged out of existence, and the company's official successor, CSX Transportation, the railroad, was founded.